Senate contest is over, and Joe Biden took home a big first-place win in South Carolina.
That's right. To dive into the election results, we have Democratic strategist Don Calloway and political reporter for Real Clear Politics, Philip Wegman, two great friends of the show. Good to see you guys.
Gentlemen, great to see you guys. Nice little coordination going on.
I know. I'm loving
like
this
it.
right here. And so, I mean, we have all of your great expertise. We're very happy. Don, let's begin with you. So I think we have some South Carolina totals on the African-American support in particular that came out of South Carolina. And one of the interesting things about the vote total that we saw there, Don, is how many of them actually said that they supported Biden only after the Clyburn endorsement. Yeah. This is one of the rare instances that we've seen an establishment endorsement actually matter so much to voters. Could you just maybe explain why that
absolutely.
is?
So we in the bubble know Jim Clyburn as a congressman, as a member of leadership. Jim Clyburn has a 60-year history of civil rights leadership in South Carolina. He is not to be trifled with. He is a real deal boss, probably one of the last old school political leaders we have in this country. But Jim Clyburn, I mean, you have people alive who lived under Jim Crow. Jim Clyburn helped folks get out of that. Jim Clyburn, his wife, Emily Clyburn, who just passed, Septima Clark. These are legends of the civil rights movement. He just happens to be in Congress right now. So his endorsement carries a tremendous amount of weight, more so than probably even folks who were asking for his endorsement really even knew. Yeah. Jim Clyburn knows every black person in South Carolina, likely because he has touched their lives on a very personal level.
Very interesting. I mean, that was something I certainly underestimated. Was just, I mean, that 50% of voters would say that this endorsement was close to them. Because what we mostly see in these contests is endorsements. I mean, Joe Biden had tons of endorsements in Iowa. Didn't matter. Tons of endorsements in Nevada. Didn't really matter. New Hampshire, etc. But that one was a huge, huge difference maker for him, Philip. And I mean, it really has resuscitated his campaign. Now he's in the fight. Now he's got a shot, where before South Carolina really wasn't looking good.
And Joe Biden knows that. What did he say on stage at his victory event? He said, "You brought me back to Clyburn." And you talk about him as an old school political boss. That's exactly what this guy has been able to do down there. The energy around him is magnetic. I have never seen a Joe Biden event get that enthusiastic.
And you've been there. You've been on the ground for all of these things. So tell us what it was like to be in South Carolina when that happened. Were you expecting to see the Biden victory of 28% that we saw? 28%.
Look, I think that we all expected that Biden was likely going to win there. But what I don't think a lot of us were expecting was for him to win so decisively and sort of pull up around Sanders in the delegate count there. But what I found really interesting is that the theory of the case that Joe Biden made, he fled New Hampshire, he gets to the airport, doesn't even wait for results on that primary night, and he says to South Carolina, "This is what real America looks like. We're waiting for African-American and Latino voters." And it was even a little bit on the nose. He didn't quite give an inspirational pitch. He just said, "I'm here. These are the voters that matter, and this is going to, work out for me." And then it did.
Well, pick up on that point, John, because he had an incredibly dominant performance with African Americans in South Carolina, no doubt. A lot of the national polling shows a very different picture, though. I mean, the most recent national polls actually have Bernie Sanders leading with black voters, certainly with the most diverse coalition. He's been incredibly dominant with Latino voters. This is Morning Consult, primary preference among black voters. Speak to the sort of regional variations, the generational differences, because it's not accurate to just say, like, this group in this state represents everybody, right?
Well, I'll say what I've said on this show before. Let's start with the basic premise that black people are people, right? Bernie Sanders is leading with people, and that's something that the Democrats should acknowledge. Bernie Sanders has been able to expand the electorate. So I think that what you see with him having a national lead in black voters is the idea that he has a whole lot of young folks who are black and brown, who would probably not be participating in the process otherwise, are coming out strictly for him, and that is an immutable block of support. And that's probably the delta in black support between him and Joe Biden. So Bernie Sanders has brought new people into the process, expanded the pie, and that's why you see him leading in overall black and brown folks.
However, Don, I mean, we look at numbers in Alabama. The Alabama Black Caucus actually endorsed Michael Bloomberg, but we also see that they have a huge amount of, which is,
I wonder if they're regretting that now.
Anyway. I mean, there's a whole lot of money, I think, that came behind it.
Alabama's a different beast. Joe Reed is a different guy down there.
But tell us, in Super Tuesday in particular, these voters probably bear more resemblance, at least in the South, than they to South Carolina than they do elsewhere. However, I will say significant black population in California, and they're not necessarily, Jim Clyburn. I mean, it's generational, regional, et cetera, whenever it comes down.
Well, I mean, I think that in the South, you'll see Joe Biden do extraordinarily well. But I think one thing that we saw in South Carolina was Bernie, emerged with a legitimate claim to doing well among African Americans.
He did.
Joe Biden dominated, but Bernie did not embarrass himself like a lot of other candidates down the ballot.
And he won young black voters.
He won young black voters. He had a substantial amount of support. I saw Philip Agnew there all the time when I was there over the last 6 months. You know, Bernie had an energized coalition of black folks down in South Carolina. They skewed younger, but Bernie will go through Super Tuesday with a substantial amount of support from black voters.
And on the flip side of that Don was alluding to is, you know, Pete, I think he got 3% black voters in South Carolina. And his pitch was always that he was going to be able to win Iowa, right, do well in New Hampshire, and that then it was the Obama path. Then black voters were suddenly going to decide this white guy is for me.
Right.
Didn't work out for him. And you also have Elizabeth Warren, who, you know, has gotten a lot of, and this is the article you were quoted in the New York Times, a lot of that sort of grass top support. A lot of organizational leaders have backed her because of, you know, her language and her plans has not translated on the ground. I think she got 4% with black voters in South Carolina.
Yeah, it was very embarrassing. Quickly to Mayor Pete, though, for a second, what I find so interesting is that this is someone who always fails upward. And him dropping out of the race ahead of Super Tuesday is, I think, the perfect consultant play. Because
I'm with you.
A lot of
totally.
votes, you know, but he's still going to profit. Why?
Right.
Because he is going to be a former presidential candidate for the rest of his life.
That's right.
And it's not different from what, you know, McKinsey does, for instance. McKinsey might come in and work for a company. It doesn't matter whether or not the company profits or turns around. They're still getting paid.
Well said, Phil.
I think that this
I posited,
That's so true.
what grifting nonprofit will he start that has the word Heartland in it? So that's what I'm waiting to see what the Heartland
He'll get
Institute
the corporate comms gig too.
Maybe that's probably.
I mean, talk a little bit about Pete though, Don.
Yeah.
What is about his pitch that never landed, that never broke through, and what do you think of his move to drop out right now?
Well, Pete is dynamic and he's talented, and I would imagine that we have not seen the last of Pete in high-profile American civic life.
Is that a promise or a threat?
Pete is talented, and he ran an extraordinary campaign.
He did.
The time to develop honest and earnest and real relationships with people of color is not when you are running for president.
Right.
We know that. We see through that. And that applies to everybody across the board.
Right.
Bernie developed them in earnest over the last 5 years, right? And he invested in minority candidates. I ran campaigns that Bernie was an active role in Birmingham and Little Rock and so on and so forth. Joe Biden, what we saw in South Carolina is a 30-year history of Joe Biden having relationships with this particular state's African-American community through Fritz Hollings and so on and so forth. And you saw that manifested. The time to start building these relationships is not when you start running for president. There's simply not enough time for it to work. And frankly, it's not genuine. And I don't say that as a diss to Pete. But
would you say the same thing about Elizabeth Warren? I thought that piece in the Times was really interesting.
It was tough. I mean, she had the support. Well, I think, again, black people as a reflection of overall humans, right? Twitter is not real life, right? And my brother Antoine C. Wright says that all the time. This Twitter stuff is not real life. And she galvanized the black woman Twitterati in a way that was inspiring and probably made us, the us's of the world, believe that there was something more there in terms of actual in terms of actual electoral support than there was. One thing, though, I will say on Pete about the strategy of him dropping out, and I'll wrap it up here, is that I don't believe it's part of a thing to block Bernie and all of that, because when you're campaigning at the level that Pete is, it costs $1 million a day to sustain that operation. And the day you realize, the moment you realize it's not mathematically possible, you need to get up out of there.
Although,
so that applies to more than just
John,
Pete at this
what
point.
his team leaked to CNN and others and MSNBC is that it was explicitly to keep Bernie from running away with the majority.
Apparently, CNN reporting today that he's floating endorsement of Joe Biden. Maybe not before Super Tuesday, but possibly.
I would not be surprised to see him endorse somebody other than Joe Biden, just from what I hear.
That'd be interesting.
But
all right.
But also I think that's a silly leak, right?
Yeah.
Because,
you think he's going to go with Tulsi?
I don't think he's going to go with Tulsi. I don't think he's going to go with Tulsi.
All right, guys.
All right, we're going to get into Super Tuesday. Stick with us right after this.